Welcome to the space where whispers bright, the quiet echoes of the silence rise, defying the riot, and filtered stories pouring out like rivers wide. Truth unfolds in shadows where the secrets hide. This is not a place for polished, perfect lies, but a mirror to the soul where the real truth lies. From the corners of the unheard, the forgotten cry, we gather every voice beneath the open sky, open sky. No mask, no curtains, no scripted.
Let's start with a provocative question. Did decades of political strategy, not just violence, help create today's crisis in Gaza? History isn't simply a backdrop here, it's a series of choices, each with real-world fallout. Imagine stepping back to the 1970s, when Israeli authorities, threatened by secular Palestinian groups like the PLO, chose to tolerate and sometimes even quietly enable Islamist organizations in the occupied territories. You might ask, why would any government empower its ideological foes? The rationale: divide and rule. By weakening secular nationalists, officials hope to fragment opposition. But here's the twist: some of those social networks evolved into Hamas, a group whose power and tactics would later reshape the region. Political scientists call this blowback, where short-term tactics spark long-term, unpredictable consequences. It's like planting fast-growing hedges to block your neighbor's view, only to have them swallow your own garden years later. And as the decades rolled forward, this pattern of strategic maneuvering deepened. Gaza and the West Bank became test cases for policies that isolated, divided, and ultimately destabilized. Now, you might be thinking, was this just geopolitical chess, or did leaders foresee the risks? The historical record shows a mix of calculation and unintended harm. We'll dig deeper into how these early choices, tolerance of rival factions, support for religious charities, created a political environment where Hamas could grow. But keep this in mind: when governments play factions against each other, the line between control and chaos is razor thin. So, as we move forward, consider this: how many crises are crafted not just by enemies, but by the long shadow of our own policies? That's the uncomfortable root of today's debate. Fast forward to recent years, and the accusation sharpens. Did Israeli leaders, especially under Netanyahu, prop up Hamas, not by direct support, but by shaping the battlefield for political gain? This isn't about wild conspiracy. The distinction here is critical. Propping up is not the same as orchestrating attacks. Legally, that's a world apart. Imagine a game of balance. A government allows just enough instability to justify crackdowns and security-first politics. That's the allegation. Policies like easing restrictions for Hamas at times, or blocking Palestinian Authority influence in Gaza, allowed Hamas to entrench itself. Political scientists call this controlled instability, a tactic where a leader manages but doesn't fully extinguish the threat. Think of it like a firebreak in a forest. Let some areas burn slowly to prevent a wildfire, but risk losing control entirely. Now, you might be thinking, that sounds dangerously cynical. Could politicians really benefit from ongoing conflict? In electoral politics, the answer is often yes. Security threats harden political attitudes and can sway votes toward the hardline camp. But the legal and moral line is thin. Enabling a group through policy by weakening rivals, creating incentives, or avoiding decisive solutions can set the stage for tragedy without direct culpability. That's why both critics and defenders argue so fiercely over the intent and effect of government actions. So, when you hear the phrase Netanyahu propped up Hamas, understand it's about a web of policy impacts, not secret handshakes in smoky rooms. The question we face: when does political calculation cross into moral negligence? Let's get specific. What did these enabling policies look like on the ground? First, consider fragmentation, splitting Palestinian governance between Gaza and the West Bank. By supporting Gaza's separation, Israeli leadership undercut the moderate Palestinian Authority, leaving Gaza politically isolated. Next, the blockade, a technical term for a system that restricts goods movement and trade. Picture trying to run a city with half of everything cut off: food, medicine, fuel. Humanitarian groups call this collective punishment. Governments call it security. And there's selective enforcement. Sometimes policies would allow limited economic activity or temporary openings, stabilizing Hamas's rule while undermining alternatives. It's a bit like patching up the roof only when rain is forecast, never fixing the foundation. Critics argue these choices weren't accidental. Political incentives in Israel often rewarded leaders who took a tough line or refused concessions. In the language of public policy, this is called security maximalism, always opting for the most forceful response, often at civilian expense. So, ask yourself, what happens when a government's short-term political gain systematically erodes hope, institutions, and daily survival for another people? That's the hidden cost behind the headlines and the setting for catastrophe. Now, let's talk accountability. Here's where technical terms like genocide and crimes against humanity come into play, words with precise legal definitions and huge stakes. In December 2024, Amnesty International concluded that Israeli operations in Gaza met the definition of genocide, acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a protected group. That's not a casual accusation; it's grounded in patterns of mass killing, deprivation, and dehumanization. Meanwhile, Human Rights Watch documented forced displacement and destruction of civilian infrastructure, what international law calls collective punishment. The United Nations and the International Criminal Court (ICC) have advanced formal inquiries, naming officials, and taking judicial steps. These aren't just headlines, they're signals of the gravity with which the world views the crisis. Now you might wonder, can we ever really prove intent at the highest level? Courts require evidence that leaders specifically meant to destroy a group. That's a high bar one, met only with direct evidence or overwhelming patterns. Still, when repeated policies foreseeably cause civilian devastation, when leaders use dehumanizing language, when aid is blocked, and infrastructure destroyed, moral and legal responsibility accumulates, even if intent is debated, the suffering is indisputable. So, as you reflect, ask, should governments be judged only by provable intent, or also by the predictable outcomes of their choices? That is the core of the debate, now unfolding in courtrooms, in parliaments, and in the conscience of the world. Let's bring it home. Who is accountable when policy helps lay the groundwork for mass suffering? If you feel overwhelmed by numbers and legal terms, remember this: behind every data point is a human story, a lost future, a grieving family. Former Israeli officials have admitted, sometimes bluntly, that policies help keep Hamas alive. Meanwhile, current leaders defend their actions as necessary self-defense, especially after October 7, a day of horrific attacks that demand their own accountability. The challenge for all of us: to hold every side to the same moral standard. That means condemning terror, yes, but also questioning policies that treat civilian lives as expendable collateral. International law is clear. State power must never be a shield for crimes. Now, you might ask, what can we actually do? Here's my answer. Read the sources in the show notes, support independent investigations, and pressure governments to respect international law. Don't let partisanship blind you. To suffering, demand accountability from all actors, not just the ones you oppose. Because in the end, justice isn't about whose tribe wins. It's about recognizing humanity everywhere and never letting power erase the cost of its own choices.